Dubliners by Joyce. Clay. The matron had given her leave to go out as soon as the women's tea was over, and Maria looked forward to her evening out. The kitchen was spick and span. The cook said you could see yourself in the big copper boilers. The fire was nice and bright, and on one of the side tables were 4 very big barmbracks. These barmbracks seemed uncut, but if you went closer you would see that they had been cut into long thick even slices and were ready to be handed round at tea. Maria had cut them herself. Maria was a very, very small person indeed, but she had a very long nose and a very long chin. She talked a little through her nose, always soothingly, yes, my dear, and no, my dear. She was always sent for when the women quarrelled over their tubs and always succeeded in making peace. Maria, you are a veritable peacemaker. And the sub-matron and 2 of the board ladies had heard the compliment. And Ginger Mooney was always saying what she wouldn't do to the dummy who had charge of the irons if it wasn't for Maria. Everyone was so fond of Maria. The women would have their tea at 6 o'clock and she would be able to get away before 7. From Ballsbridge to the Pillar, 20 minutes, from the Pillar to Drumcondra, 20 minutes, and 20 minutes to buy the things. She would be there before 8. She took out her purse with the silver clasps and read again the words _ a present from Belfast _ She was very fond of that purse because Joe had brought it to her 5 years before when he and Alfie had gone to Belfast on a Whitmunday trip. In the purse were 2 half-crowns and some coppers. She would have 5 shillings clear after paying tram fare. What a nice evening they would have, all the children singing. Only she hoped that Joe wouldn't come in drunk. He was so different when he took any drink. Often he had wanted her to go and live with them, but she would have felt herself in the way, though Joe's wife was ever so nice with her, and she had become accustomed to the life of the laundry. Joe was a good fellow. Mama is Mama, but Maria is my proper mother. After the break-up at home the boys had got her that position in the Dublin by lamplight laundry, and she liked it. She used to have such a bad opinion of Protestants, but now she thought they were very nice people, a little quiet and serious, but still very nice people to live with. Then she had her plants in the conservatory and she liked looking after them. She had lovely ferns and wax plants, and whenever anyone came to visit her, she always gave the visitor 1 or 2 slips from her conservatory. There was one thing she didn't like, and that was the tracts on the walks, but the matron was such a nice person to deal with, so genteel. When the cook told her everything was ready, she went into the women's room and began to pull the big bell. In a few minutes the women began to come in by 2s and 3s. Wiping their steaming hands in their petticoats and pulling down the sleeves of their blouses over their red steaming arms, they settled down before their huge mugs, which the cook and the dummy filled up with hot tea, already mixed with milk and sugar in huge tin cans. Maria superintended the distribution of the barmbrack and saw that every woman got her 4 slices. There was a great deal of laughing and joking during the meal. Lizzie Fleming said Maria was sure to get the ring, and, though Fleming had said that for so many Hallow Eves, Maria had to laugh and say she didn't want any ring or man either, and when she laughed her grey-green eyes sparkled with disappointed shyness and the tip of her nose nearly met the tip of her chin. Then Ginger Mooney lifted up her mug of tea and proposed Maria's health while all the other women clattered with their mugs on the table, and said she was sorry she hadn't a sup of porter to drink it in. And Maria laughed again till the tip of her nose nearly met the tip of her chin, until her minute body nearly shook itself asunder, because she knew that Mooney meant well, though. Of course, she had the notions of a common woman. But wasn't Maria glad when the women had finished their tea and the cook and the dummy had begun to clear away the tea things? She went into her little bedroom and, remembering that the next morning was a mass morning, changed the hand of the alarm from 7 to 6. Then she took off her working skirt and her house boots and laid her best skirt out on the bed and her tiny dress boots beside the foot of the bed. She changed her blouse too, and, as she stood before the mirror, she thought of how she used to dress for Mass on Sunday morning when she was a young girl. And she looked with quaint affection at the diminutive body which she had so often adorned. In spite of its years she found it a nice tidy little body. When she got outside the streets were shining with rain and she was glad of her old brown waterproof. The tram was full and she had to sit on the little stool at the end of the car, facing all the people, with her toes barely touching the floor. She arranged in her mind all she was going to do and thought how much better it was to be independent and to have your own money in your pocket. She hoped they would have a nice evening. She was sure they would, but she could not help thinking what a pity it was Alfie and Joe were not speaking. They were always falling out now, but when they were boys together they used to be the best of friends, but such was life. She got out of her tram at the pillar and ferreted her way quickly among the crowds. She went into Downes's cake shop, but the shop was so full of people that it was a long time before she could get herself attended to. She bought a dozen of mixed penny cakes, and at last came out of the shop laden with a big bag. Then she thought, what else would she buy? She wanted to buy something really nice. They would be sure to have plenty of apples and nuts. It was hard to know what to buy, and all she could think of was cake. She decided to buy some plum cake, but Downes's plum cake had not enough almond icing on top of it, so she went over to a shop in Henry Street. Here she was a long time in suiting herself, and the stylish young lady behind the counter, who was evidently a little annoyed by her, asked her was it wedding cake she wanted to buy. 2 and 4, please. She thought she would have to stand in the Drumcondra tram because none of the young men seemed to notice her, but an elderly gentleman made room for her. He was a stout gentleman and he wore a brown hard hat. He had a square red face and a greyish moustache. Maria thought he was a colonel-looking gentleman, and she reflected how much more polite he was than the young men who simply stared straight before them. The gentleman began to chat with her about Hallow Eve and the rainy weather. He supposed the bag was full of good things for the little ones and said it was only right that the youngsters should enjoy themselves while they were young. Maria agreed with him and favoured him with demure nods, and he was very nice with her, and when she was getting out at the canal bridge she thanked him and bowed. And he bowed to her and raised his hat and smiled agreeably, and while she was going up along the terrace, bending her tiny head under the rain, she thought how easy it was to know a gentleman even when he has a drop taken. Everybody said, "Oh, here's Maria." When she came to Joe's house. Joe was there, having come home from business, and all the children had their Sunday dresses on. There were 2 big girls in from next door and games were going on. "Thanks, Maria." But Maria said she had brought something special for Papa and Mama, something they would be sure to like, and she began to look for her plum cake. She tried in Downes's bag and then in the pockets of her waterproof and then on the hall stand, but nowhere could she find it. Then she asked all the children had any of them eaten it by mistake, of course, but the children all said no and looked as if they did not like to eat cakes if they were to be accused of stealing. Everybody had a solution for the mystery, and Mrs. Donnelly said it was plain that Maria had left it behind her in the tram. Maria, remembering how confused the gentleman with the greyish moustache had made her, coloured with shame and vexation and disappointment. At the thought of the failure of her little surprise and of the 2 and 4pence she had thrown away for nothing, she nearly cried outright. But Joe said it didn't matter and made her sit down by the fire. He was very nice with her. He told her all that went on in his office, repeating for her a smart answer which he had made to the manager. Maria did not understand why Joe laughed so much over the answer he had made, but she said that the manager must have been a very overbearing person to deal with. Joe said he wasn't so bad when you knew how to take him, that he was a decent sort so long as you didn't rub him the wrong way. Mrs. Donnelly played the piano for the children and they danced and sang. Then the 2 next-door girls handed round the nuts. Nobody could find the nutcrackers and Joe was nearly getting cross over it and asked how did they expect Maria to crack nuts without a nutcracker. But Maria said she didn't like nuts and that they weren't to bother about her. Then Joe asked would she take a bottle of stout, and Mrs. Donnelly said there was port wine too in the house if she would prefer that. Maria said she would rather they didn't ask her to take anything, but Joe insisted. So Maria let him have his way and they sat by the fire talking over old times, and Maria thought she would put in a good word for Alfie. But Joe cried that God might strike him stone dead if ever he spoke a word to his brother again, and Maria said she was sorry she had mentioned the matter. Mrs. Donnelly told her husband it was a great shame for him to speak that way of his own flesh and blood, but Joe said that Alfie was no brother of his and there was nearly being a row on the head of it. But Joe said he would not lose his temper on account of the night it was and asked his wife to open some more stout. The 2 next-door girls had arranged some Hallow Eve games and soon everything was merry again. Maria was delighted to see the children so merry and Joe and his wife in such good spirits. The next-door girls put some saucers on the table and then led the children up to the table, blindfold. One got the prayer book and the other three got the water, and when one of the next-door girls got the ring, Mrs. Donnelly shook her finger at the blushing girl as much as to say, "Oh, I know all about it." They insisted then on blindfolding Maria and leading her up to the table to see what she would get. And, while they were putting on the bandage, Maria laughed and laughed again till the tip of her nose nearly met the tip of her chin. They led her up to the table amid laughing and joking, and she put her hand out in the air as she was told to do. She moved her hand about here and there in the air and descended on one of the saucers. She felt a soft wet substance with her fingers and was surprised that nobody spoke or took off her bandage. There was a pause for a few seconds, and then a great deal of scuffling and whispering. Somebody said something about the garden, and at last Mrs. Donnelly said something very cross to one of the next-door girls and told her to throw it out at once. That was no play. Maria understood that it was wrong that time, and so she had to do it over again, and this time she got the prayer book. After that, Mrs. Donnelly played Miss MacLeod's reel for the children, and Joe made Maria take a glass of wine. Soon they were all quite merry again, and Mrs. Donnelly said Maria would enter a convent before the year was out because she had got the prayer book. Maria had never seen Joe so nice to her as he was that night, so full of pleasant talk and reminiscences. She said they were all very good to her. At last the children grew tired and sleepy, and Joe asked Maria would she not sing some little song before she went, one of the old songs. Mrs. Donnelly said, "Do, please, Maria." And so Maria had to get up and stand beside the piano. Mrs. Donnelly bade the children be quiet and listen to Maria's song. Then she played the prelude and said, "Now, Maria." And Maria, blushing very much, began to sing in a tiny quavering voice. I dreamt that I dwelt in marble halls with vassals and serfs at my side, and of all who assembled within those walls that I was the hope and the pride. I had riches too great to count, could boast of a high ancestral name, but I also dreamt, which pleased me most, that you loved me still the same. But no one tried to show her mistake, and when she had ended her song Joe was very much moved. He said that there was no time like the long ago and no music for him like poor old Bath, whatever other people might say. And his eyes filled up so much with tears that he could not find what he was looking for, and in the end he had to ask his wife to tell him where the Corkscrew was. A painful case. Mr. James Duffy lived in Chapelizod because he wished to live as far as possible from the city of which he was a citizen, and because he found all the other suburbs of Dublin mean, modern and pretentious. He lived in an old sombre house, and from his windows he could look into the disused distillery or upwards along the shallow river on which Dublin is built. The lofty walls of his uncarpeted room were free from pictures. He had himself bought every article of furniture in the room, a black iron bedstead, an iron washstand, 4 cane chairs, a clothes rack, a coal scuttle, a fender, an irons, and a square table on which lay a double desk. A bookcase had been made in an alcove by means of shelves of whitewood. The bed was clothed with white bedclothes, and a black and scarlet rug covered the foot. A little hand mirror hung above the washstand, and during the day a white shaded lamp stood as the sole ornament of the mantelpiece. The books on the white wooden shelves were arranged from below upwards according to bulk. A complete Wordsworth stood at one end of the lowest shelf, and a copy of the Maynooth Catechism sewn into the cloth cover of a notebook stood at one end of the top shelf. Writing materials were always on the desk. In the desk lay a manuscript translation of Hauptmann's Michael Kramer the stage directions of which were written in purple ink, and a little sheaf of papers held together by a brass pin. In these sheets a sentence was inscribed from time to time, and, in an ironical moment, the headline of an advertisement for Bilebeans had been pasted onto the first sheet. On lifting the lid of the desk a faint fragrance escaped, the fragrance of new cedarwood pencils, or of a bottle of gum, or of an overripe apple which might have been left there and forgotten. Mr. Duffy abhorred anything which betokened physical or mental disorder. A medieval doctor would have called him saturnine. His face, which carried the entire tale of his years, was of the brown tint of Dublin streets. On his long and rather large head grew dry black hair, and a tawny moustache did not quite cover an unamiable mouth. His cheekbones also gave his face a harsh character, but there was no harshness in the eyes which, looking at the world from under their tawny eyebrows, gave the impression of a man ever alert to greet a redeeming instinct in others but often disappointed. He lived at a little distance from his body, regarding his own acts with doubtful side glances. He had an odd autobiographical habit which led him to compose in his mind from time to time a short sentence about himself containing a subject in the third person and a predicate in the past tense. He never gave alms to beggars and walked firmly, carrying a stout hazel. He had been for many years cashier of a private bank in Baggot Street. Every morning he came in from Chapelizer by tram. At midday he went to Dan Burke's and took his lunch, a bottle of lager beer and a small trayful of arrowroot biscuits. At 4 o'clock he was set free. He dined in an eating house in George's Street where he felt himself safe from the society of Dublin's gilded youth and where there was a certain plain honesty in the bill of fare. His evenings were spent either before his landlady's piano or roaming about the outskirts of the city. His liking for Mozart's music brought him sometimes to an opera or a concert. These were the only dissipations of his life. He had neither companions nor friends, church nor creed. He lived his spiritual life without any communion with others, visiting his relatives at Christmas and escorting them to the cemetery when they died. He performed these two social duties for old dignity's sake but conceded nothing further to the conventions which regulate the civic life. He allowed himself to think that in certain circumstances he would rob his bank, but as these circumstances never arose, his life rolled out evenly an adventureless tale. One evening he found himself sitting beside two ladies in the rotunda. The house, thinly peopled and silent, gave distressing prophecy of failure. "What a pity there is such a poor house tonight. It's so hard on people to have to sing to empty benches." He took the remark as an invitation to talk. He was surprised that she seemed so little awkward. While they talked he tried to fix her permanently in his memory. When he learned that the young girl beside her was her daughter he judged her to be a year or so younger than himself. Her face, which must have been handsome, had remained intelligent. It was an oval face with strongly marked features. The eyes were very dark blue and steady. Their gaze began with a defiant note but was confused by what seemed a deliberate swoon of the pupil into the iris, revealing for an instant a temperament of great sensibility. The pupil reasserted itself quickly. This half-disclosed nature fell again under the reign of prudence. And her astrakhan jacket, moulding a bosom of a certain fullness, struck the note of defiance more definitely. He met her again a few weeks afterwards at a concert in Earlsfort Terrace and seized the moment when her daughter's attention was diverted to become intimate. She alluded once or twice to her husband, but her tone was not such as to make the allusion a warning. Her name was Mrs. Sinico. Her husband's great-great-grandfather had come from Ligorne. Her husband was captain of a mercantile boat plying between Dublin and Holland, and they had one child. Meeting her a third time by accident he found courage to make an appointment. She came. This was the first of many meetings. They met always in the evening and chose the most quiet quarters for their walks together. Mr. Duffy, however, had a distaste for underhand ways and, finding that they were compelled to meet stealthily, he forced her to ask him to her house. Captain Sinico encouraged his visits, thinking that his daughter's hand was in question. He had dismissed his wife so sincerely from his gallery of pleasures that he did not suspect that anyone else would take an interest in her. As the husband was often away and the daughter out giving music lessons, Mr. Duffy had many opportunities of enjoying the lady's society. Neither he nor she had any such adventure before, and neither was conscious of any incongruity. Little by little he entangled his thoughts with hers. He lent her books, provided her with ideas, shared his intellectual life with her. She listened to all. Sometimes in return for his theory she gave out some fact of her own life. With almost maternal solicitude she urged him to let his nature open to the full. She became his confessor. He told her that for some time he had assisted at the meetings of an Irish socialist party where he had felt himself a unique figure amidst a score of sober workmen in a garret lit by an inefficient oil lamp. When the party had divided into 3 sections, each under its own leader and in its own garret, he had discontinued his attendances. The workmen's discussions, he said, were too timorous. The interest they took in the question of wages was inordinate. He felt that they were hard-featured realists and that they resented an exactitude which was the produce of a leisure not within their reach. No social revolution, he told her, would be likely to strike Dublin for some centuries. She asked him why did he not write out his thoughts. For what? He asked her, with careful scorn. To compete with phrasemongers, incapable of thinking consecutively for 60 seconds? To submit himself to the criticisms of an obtuse middle class which entrusted its morality to policemen and its fine arts to impresarios? He went often to her little cottage outside Dublin, often they spent their evenings alone. Little by little, as their thoughts entangled, they spoke of subjects less remote. Her companionship was like a warm soil about an exotic. Many times she allowed the dark to fall upon them, refraining from lighting the lamp. The dark discreet room, their isolation, the music that still vibrated in their ears united them. This union exalted him, wore away the rough edges of his character, emotionalized his mental life. Sometimes he caught himself listening to the sound of his own voice. He thought that in her eyes he would ascend to an angelical stature, and, as he attached the fervent nature of his companion more and more closely to him, he heard the strange impersonal voice which he recognized as his own, insisting on the soul's incurable loneliness. "We cannot give ourselves," it said, "we are our own." The end of these discourses was that one night during which she had shown every sign of unusual excitement, Mrs. Sinico caught up his hand passionately and pressed it to her cheek. Mr. Duffy was very much surprised. Her interpretation of his words disillusioned him. He did not visit her for a week, then he wrote to her asking her to meet him. As he did not wish their last interview to be troubled by the influence of their ruined confessional, they met in a little cake shop near the park gate. It was cold autumn weather, but in spite of the cold they wandered up and down the roads of the park for nearly 3 hours. They agreed to break off their intercourse. "Every bond," he said, "is a bond to sorrow." When they came out of the park they walked in silence towards the tram, but here she began to tremble so violently that, fearing another collapse on her part, he bade her goodbye quickly and left her. A few days later he received a parcel containing his books and music. For years past, Mr. Duffy returned to his even way of life. His room still bore witness of the orderliness of his mind. Some new pieces of music encumbered the music stand in the lower room, and on his shelves stood 2 volumes by Nietzsche, Thus Spake Zarathustra and The Gay Science . He wrote seldom in the sheaf of papers which lay in his desk. One of his sentences, written 2 months after his last interview with Mrs. Sinico, read, "Love between man and man is impossible because there must not be sexual intercourse, and friendship between man and woman is impossible because there must be sexual intercourse." He kept away from concerts lest he should meet her. His father died, the junior partner of the bank retired. And still every morning he went into the city by tram, and every evening walked home from the city after having dined moderately in George's Street and read the evening paper for dessert. One evening as he was about to put a morsel of corned beef and cabbage into his mouth, his hand stopped. His eyes fixed themselves on a paragraph in the evening paper which he had propped against the water carafe. He replaced the morsel of food on his plate and read the paragraph attentively. Then he drank a glass of water, pushed his plate to one side, doubled the paper down before him between his elbows and read the paragraph over and over again. The cabbage began to deposit a cold white grease on his plate. The girl came over to him to ask was his dinner not properly cooked. He said it was very good and ate a few mouthfuls of it with difficulty. Then he paid his bill and went out. He walked along quickly through the November twilight, his stout hazel stick striking the ground regularly, the fringe of the buff_male_ peeping out of a side pocket of his tight reefer overcoat. On the lonely road which leads from the park gate to Chapelizod he slackened his pace. His stick struck the ground less emphatically and his breath, issuing irregularly, almost with a sighing sound, condensed in the wintry air. When he reached his house he went up at once to his bedroom and, taking the paper from his pocket, read the paragraph again by the failing light of the window. He read it not aloud, but moving his lips as a priest does when he reads the prayers _secreto_. Death of a lady at Sydney Parade. A painful case. Today at the City of Dublin Hospital the Deputy Coroner, in the absence of Mr. Leverett, held an inquest on the body of Mrs. Emily Sinico, aged 43 years, who was killed at Sydney Parade Station yesterday evening. The evidence showed that the deceased lady, while attempting to cross the line, was knocked down by the engine of the 10 o'clock slow train from Kingstown, thereby sustaining injuries of the head and right side which led to her death. James Lennon, driver of the engine, stated that he had been in the employment of the railway company for 15 years. On hearing the guard's whistle, he set the train in motion and a second or two afterwards brought it to rest in response to loud cries. The train was going slowly. Peter Dunn, railway porter, stated that as the train was about to start he observed a woman attempting to cross the lines. He ran towards her and shouted, but before he could reach her, she was caught by the buffer of the engine and fell to the ground. _A juror_. You saw the lady fall. _witness_. Yes. Police Sergeant Crowley deposed that when he arrived he found the deceased lying on the platform apparently dead. He had the body taken to the waiting room pending the arrival of the ambulance. Constable 57E corroborated. Dr. Halpin, assistant house surgeon of the City of Dublin Hospital, stated that the deceased had 2 lower ribs fractured and had sustained severe contusions of the right shoulder. The right side of the head had been injured in the fall. The injuries were not sufficient to have caused death in a normal person. Death, in his opinion, had been probably due to shock and sudden failure of the heart's action. Mr. H.B. Patterson Finlay, on behalf of the railway company, expressed his deep regret at the accident. The company had always taken every precaution to prevent people crossing the lines except by the bridges, both by placing notices in every station and by the use of patent spring gates at level crossings. The deceased had been in the habit of crossing the lines late at night from platform to platform and, in view of certain other circumstances of the case, he did not think the railway officials were to blame. Captain Sinico, of Learville, Sydney Parade, husband of the deceased, also gave evidence. He stated that the deceased was his wife. He was not in Dublin at the time of the accident as he had arrived only that morning from Rotterdam. They had been married for 22 years and had lived happily until about 2 years ago when his wife began to be rather intemperate in her habits. Miss Mary Sinico said that of late her mother had been in the habit of going out at night to buy spirits. She, witness, had often tried to reason with her mother and had induced her to join a league. She was not at home until an hour after the accident. The jury returned a verdict in accordance with the medical evidence and exonerated Lennon from all blame. The deputy coroner said it was a most painful case and expressed great sympathy with Captain Sinico and his daughter. He urged on the railway company to take strong measures to prevent the possibility of similar accidents in the future. No blame attached to anyone. Mr. Duffy raised his eyes from the paper and gazed out of his window on the cheerless evening landscape. The river lay quiet beside the empty distillery and from time to time a light appeared in some house on the Lucan Road. What an end! The whole narrative of her death revolted him, and it revolted him to think that he had ever spoken to her of what he held sacred. The threadbare phrases, the inane expressions of sympathy, the cautious words of a reporter won over to conceal the details of a commonplace vulgar death attacked his stomach. Not merely had she degraded herself, she had degraded him. He saw the squalid tract of her vice, miserable and malodorous. His soul's companion. He thought of the hobbling wretches whom he had seen carrying cans and bottles to be filled by the barman. Just God, what an end! Evidently she had been unfit to live, without any strength of purpose, an easy prey to habits, one of the wrecks on which civilization has been reared. But that she could have sunk so low! Was it possible he had deceived himself so utterly about her? He remembered her outburst of that night and interpreted it in a harsher sense than he had ever done. He had no difficulty now in approving of the course he had taken. As the light failed and his memory began to wander, he thought her hand touched his. The shock which had first attacked his stomach was now attacking his nerves. He put on his overcoat and hat quickly and went out. The cold air met him on the threshold, it crept into the sleeves of his coat. When he came to the public house at Chapelizod Bridge he went in and ordered a hot punch. The proprietor served him obsequiously but did not venture to talk. There were 5 or 6 working men in the shop discussing the value of a gentleman's estate in County Kildare. They drank at intervals from their huge pint tumblers and smoked, spitting often on the floor and sometimes dragging the sawdust over their spits with their heavy boots. Mr. Duffy sat on his stool and gazed at them, without seeing or hearing them. After a while they went out and he called for another punch. He sat a long time over it. The shop was very quiet. The proprietor sprawled on the counter reading the _Herald_ and yawning. Now and again a tram was heard swishing along the lonely road outside. As he sat there, living over his life with her and evoking alternately the two images in which he now conceived her, he realized that she was dead, that she had ceased to exist, that she had become a memory. He began to feel ill at ease. He asked himself what else could he have done. He could not have carried on a comedy of deception with her, he could not have lived with her openly. He had done what seemed to him best. How was he to blame? Now that she was gone he understood how lonely her life must have been, sitting night after night alone in that room. His life would be lonely too until he, too, died, ceased to exist, became a memory if anyone remembered him. It was after 9 o'clock when he left the shop. The night was cold and gloomy. He entered the park by the first gate and walked along under the gaunt trees. He walked through the bleak alleys where they had walked for years before. She seemed to be near him in the darkness. At moments he seemed to feel her voice touch his ear, her hand touch his. He stood still to listen. Why had he withheld life from her? Why had he sentenced her to death? He felt his moral nature falling to pieces. When he gained the crest of the magazine hill he halted and looked along the river towards Dublin, the lights of which burned redly and hospitably in the cold night. He looked down the slope and, at the base, in the shadow of the wall of the park, he saw some human figures lying. Those venal and furtive loves filled him with despair. He gnawed the rectitude of his life, he felt that he had been outcast from life's feast. One human being had seemed to love him and he had denied her life and happiness, he had sentenced her to ignominy, a death of shame. He knew that the prostrate creatures down by the wall were watching him and wished him gone. No one wanted him, he was outcast from life's feast. He turned his eyes to the grey gleaming river, winding along towards Dublin. Beyond the river he saw a goods train winding out of Kingsbridge station, like a worm with a fiery head winding through the darkness, obstinately and laboriously. It passed slowly out of sight, but still he heard in his ears the laborious drone of the engine reiterating the syllables of her name. He turned back the way he had come, the rhythm of the engine pounding in his ears. He began to doubt the reality of what memory told him. He halted under a tree and allowed the rhythm to die away. He could not feel her near him in the darkness nor her voice touch his ear. He waited for some minutes listening. He could hear nothing, the night was perfectly silent. He listened again, perfectly silent. He felt that he was alone. Ivy day in the committee room. Old Jack raked the cinders together with a piece of cardboard and spread them judiciously over the whitening dome of coals. When the dome was thinly covered his face lapsed into darkness, but, as he set himself to fan the fire again, his crouching shadow ascended the opposite wall and his face slowly re-emerged into light. It was an old man's face, very bony and hairy. The moist blue eyes blinked at the fire and the moist mouth fell open at times, munching once or twice mechanically when it closed. "That's better now, Mr. O'Connor." Mr. O'Connor, a grey-haired young man, whose face was disfigured by many blotches and pimples, had just brought the tobacco for a cigarette into a shapely cylinder, but when spoken to he undid his handiwork meditatively. Then he began to roll the tobacco again meditatively and after a moment's thought decided to lick the paper. "Did Mr. Tierney say when he'd be back?" he asked in a husky falsetto. "He didn't say." Mr. O'Connor put his cigarette into his mouth and began to search his pockets. He took out a pack of thin pasteboard cards. "I'll get you a match," said the old man. "Never mind, this'll do," said Mr. O'Connor. He selected one of the cards and read what was printed on it: Municipal Elections. Royal Exchange Ward. Mr. Richard J. Tierney, PLG, respectfully solicits the favour of your vote and influence at the coming election in the Royal Exchange Ward. Mr. O'Connor had been engaged by Tierney's agent to canvass one part of the ward, but as the weather was inclement and his boots let in the wet, he spent a great part of the day sitting by the fire in the committee room in Wicklow Street with Jack, the old caretaker. They had been sitting thus since the short day had grown dark. It was the 6th of October, dismal and cold out of doors. Mr. O'Connor tore a strip off the card and, lighting it, lit his cigarette. As he did so the flame lit up a leaf of dark glossy ivy in the lapel of his coat. The old man watched him attentively and then, taking up the piece of cardboard again, began to fan the fire slowly while his companion smoked. "Ah, yes," he said, continuing, "it's hard to know what way to bring up children. Now who'd think he'd turn out like that? I sent him to the Christian Brothers and I done what I could for him, and there he goes boozing about. I tried to make him some way decent." He replaced the cardboard wearily. "Only I'm an old man now, I'd change his tune for him. I'd take the stick to his back and beat him while I could stand over him as I'd done many a time before. The mother, you know, she cocks him up with this and that. That's what ruins children," said Mr. O'Connor. "To be sure it is," said the old man. "And little thanks you get for it, only impudence. He takes upper hand of me whenever he sees I've a sup taken. What's the world coming to when son speaks that way to their father? What age is he?" said Mr. O'Connor. 19, said the old man. "Why don't you put him to something?" "Sure, ain't I never done at the drunken bowsy ever since he left school? I won't keep you, I says. You must get a job for yourself. But, sure, it's worse whenever he gets a job, he drinks it all." Mr. O'Connor shook his head in sympathy, and the old man fell silent, gazing into the fire. "Hello. Is this a Freemasons' meeting?" "Who's that?" said the old man. "What are you doing in the dark?" asked a voice. "Is that you, Hines?" asked Mr. O'Connor. "Yes." "What are you doing in the dark?" said Mr. Hines, advancing into the light of the fire. He was a tall, slender young man with a light brown moustache. Imminent little drops of rain hung at the brim of his hat and the collar of his jacket coat was turned up. "Well, Matt," he said to Mr. O'Connor, "how goes it?" Mr. O'Connor shook his head. The old man left the hearth and, after stumbling about the room, returned with 2 candlesticks which he thrust one after the other into the fire and carried to the table. A denuded room came into view and the fire lost all its cheerful color. The walls of the room were bare except for a copy of an election address. In the middle of the room was a small table on which papers were heaped. Mr. Hines leaned against the mantelpiece and asked, "Has he paid you yet?" "Not yet," said Mr. O'Connor. "I hope to God he'll not leave us in the lurch tonight." Mr. Hines laughed. "Oh, he'll pay you. Never fear," he said. "I hope he'll look smart about it if he means business," said Mr. O'Connor. "What do you think, Jack?" said Mr. Hines satirically to the old man. The old man returned to his seat by the fire, saying, "It isn't, but he has it, anyway. Not like the other tinker." "What other tinker?" said Mr. Hines. "Colgan," said the old man scornfully. "It is because Colgan's a working man you say that? What's the difference between a good honest bricklayer and a publican, eh? Hasn't the working man as good a right to be in the corporation as anyone else, eh? And a better right than those shoneens that are always hat in hand before any fellow with a handle to his name? Isn't that so, Matt?" said Mr. Hines, addressing Mr. O'Connor. "I think you're right," said Mr. O'Connor. "One man is a plain honest man with no hunker sliding about him. He goes in to represent the labor classes. This fellow you're working for only wants to get some job or other. Of course, the working class should be represented," said the old man. "The working man," said Mr. Hines, "gets all kicks and no halfpence. But its labor produces everything. The working man is not looking for fat jobs for his sons and nephews and cousins. The working man is not going to drag the honor of Dublin in the mud to please a German monarch." "How's that?" said the old man. "Don't you know they want to present an address of welcome to Edward Rex if he comes here next year? What do we want kowtowing to a foreign king?" "Our man won't vote for the address," said Mr. O'Connor. "He goes in on the nationalist ticket." "Won't he?" said Mr. Hines. "Wait till you see whether he will or not. I know him. Is it Tricky Dicky Teeny? By God!" "Perhaps you're right, Joe," said Mr. O'Connor. "Anyway, I wish he'd turn up with the spondulics." The 3 men fell silent. The old man began to rake more cinders together. Mr. Hines took off his hat, shook it and then turned down the collar of his coat, displaying, as he did so, an ivy leaf in the lapel. If this man was alive, he said, pointing to the leaf, we'd have no talk of an address of welcome. That's true, said Mr. O'Connor. Musha, God be with them times, said the old man. There was some life in it then. The room was silent again. Then a bustling little man with a snuffling nose and very cold ears pushed in the door. He walked over quickly to the fire, rubbing his hands as if he intended to produce a spark from them. No money, boys, he said. Sit down here, Mr. Henchie, said the old man, offering him his chair. Oh, don't stir, Jack, don't stir, said Mr. Henchie. He nodded curtly to Mr. Hines and sat down on the chair which the old man vacated. Did you serve on your street? He asked Mr. O'Connor. Yes, said Mr. O'Connor, beginning to search his pockets for memoranda. Did you call on Grimes? I did. Well? How does he stand? He wouldn't promise. He said, I won't tell anyone what way I'm going to vote. But I think he'll be all right. Why so? He asked me who the nominators were, and I told him. I mentioned Father Burke's name. I think it'll be all right. Mr. Henchie began to snuffle and to rub his hands over the fire at a terrific speed. For the love of God, Jack, bring us a bit of coal. There must be some left. The old man went out of the room. It's no go, said Mr. Henchie, shaking his head. I asked the little shoe boy, but he said, oh, now, Mr. Henchie, when I see the work going on properly I won't forget you, you may be sure. Mean little tinker. Usher, how could he be anything else? What did I tell you, Matt? Said Mr. Hines. Tricky Dicky Tinny. Oh, he's as tricky as they make them, said Mr. Henchie. He hasn't got those little pig's eyes for nothing. Blast his soul. Couldn't he pay up like a man instead of, oh, now, Mr. Henchie, I must speak to Mr. Fanning. I've spent a lot of money? Mean little shoe boy of hell. I suppose he forgets the time his little old father kept the hammer-down shop in Mary's Lane. But is that a fact? Asked Mr. O'Connor. God, yes, said Mr. Henchie. Did you never hear that? And the men used to go in on Sunday morning before the houses were open to buy a waistcoat or a trousers moire. But Tricky Dicky's little old father always had a tricky little black bottle up in a corner. Do you mind now? That's that. That's where he first saw the light. The old man returned with a few lumps of coal which he placed here and there on the fire. That's a nice how do you do, said Mr. O'Connor. How does he expect us to work for him if he won't stump up? I can't help it, said Mr. Henchie. I expect to find the bailiffs in the hall when I go home. Mr. Hines laughed and, shoving himself away from the mantelpiece with the aid of his shoulders, made ready to leave. It'll be all right when King Eddie comes, he said. Well, boys, I'm off for the present. See you later. Bye, bye. He went out of the room slowly. Bye, Joe. Mr. Henchie waited a few moments and then nodded in the direction of the door. Tell me, he said across the fire, what brings our friend in here? What does he want? Usher, poor Joe, said Mr. O'Connor, throwing the end of his cigarette into the fire, his heart up, like the rest of us. Mr. Henchie snuffled vigorously and spat so copiously that he nearly put out the fire, which uttered a hissing protest. To tell you my private and candid opinion, he said, I think he's a man from the other camp. He's a spy of Colgan's, if you ask me. Just go round and try and find out how they're getting on. They won't suspect you. Do you twig? Ah, poor Joe is a decent skin, said Mr. O'Connor. His father was a decent respectable man, Mr. Henchie admitted. Poor old Larry Hines. Many a good turn he did in his day. But I'm greatly afraid our friend is not 19 carat. Damn it, I can understand a fellow being hard up, but what I can't understand is a fellow sponging. Couldn't he have some spark of manhood about him? He doesn't get a warm welcome from me when he comes, said the old man. Let him work for his own side and not come spying around here. I don't know, said Mr. O'Connor dubiously, as he took out cigarette papers and tobacco. I think Joe Hines is a straight man. He's a clever chap, too, with the pen. Do you remember that thing he wrote? Some of these hillsiders and Fenians are a bit too clever if you ask me, said Mr. Henchie. Do you know what my private and candid opinion is about some of those little jokers? I believe half of them are in the pay of the castle. There's no knowing, said the old man. Oh, but I know it for a fact, said Mr. Henchie. They're castle hacks. I don't say Hines. No, damn it, I think he's a stroke above that. But there's a certain little nobleman with a cock-eye, you know the Patriot I'm alluding to. Mr. O'Connor nodded. There's a lineal descendant of Major Sir for you if you like. Oh, the heart's blood of a Patriot. That's a fellow now that'd sell his country for fourpence and go down on his bended knees and thank the almighty Christ he had a country to sell. There was a knock at the door. Come in, said Mr. Henchie. A person resembling a poor clergyman or a poor actor appeared in the doorway. His black clothes were tightly buttoned on his short body, and it was impossible to say whether he wore a clergyman's collar or a layman's, because the collar of his shabby frock coat, the uncovered buttons of which reflected the candlelight, was turned up about his neck. He wore a round hat of hard black felt. His face, shining with raindrops, had the appearance of damp yellow cheese save where two rosy spots indicated the cheekbones. He opened his very long mouth suddenly to express disappointment, and at the same time opened wide his very bright blue eyes to express pleasure and surprise. "Oh, Father Keegan," said Mr. Henchie, jumping up from his chair. "Is that you? Come in." "Oh, no, no, no," said Father Keegan quickly, pursing his lips as if he were addressing a child. "Won't you come in and sit down?" "No, no, no," said Father Keegan, speaking in a discreet, indulgent, velvety voice. "Don't let me disturb you now. I'm just looking for Mr. Fanning. He's round at the _Black Eagle _," said Mr. Henchie. "But won't you come in and sit down a minute?" "No, no, thank you. It was just a little business matter," said Father Keegan. "Thank you, indeed." He retreated from the doorway, and Mr. Henchie, seizing one of the candlesticks, went to the door to light him downstairs. "Oh, don't trouble, I beg." "No, but the stairs is so dark." "No, no, I can see." "Thank you, indeed." "Are you right now?" "All right, thanks." "Thanks." Mr. Henchie returned with the candlestick and put it on the table. He sat down again at the fire. There was silence for a few moments. "Tell me, John," said Mr. O'Connor, lighting his cigarette with another pasteboard card. "H.M. What he is exactly?" "Ask me an easier one," said Mr. Henchie. "Fanning and himself seem to me very thick. They're often in Kavanagh's together." "Is he a priest at all?" Yes, I believe so. I think he's what you call a black sheep. We haven't many of them, thank God. But we have a few. He's an unfortunate man of some kind." "And how does he knock it out?" asked Mr. O'Connor. "That's another mystery. Is he attached to any chapel or church or institution or—" "No," said Mr. Henchie, "I think he's travelling on his own account. God forgive me," he added, "I thought he was the dozen of stout." "Is there any chance of a drink itself?" asked Mr. O'Connor. "I'm dry too," said the old man. "I asked that little shoe boy 3 times, said Mr. Henchie, would he send up a dozen of stout. I asked him again now, but he was leaning on the counter in his shirt sleeves having a deep goster with Alderman Cowley." "Why didn't you remind him?" said Mr. O'Connor. "Well, I couldn't go over while he was talking to Alderman Cowley. I just waited till I caught his eye, and said, about that little matter I was speaking to you about. 'That'll be all right, Mr. H,' he said. Yerra, sure the little hopper my thumb has forgotten all about it. There's some deal on in that quarter," said Mr. O'Connor thoughtfully. "I saw the 3 of them hard at it yesterday at Suffolk Street corner." "I think I know the little game they're at," said Mr. Henchie. "You must owe the city fathers money nowadays if you want to be made Lord Mayor." "Then they'll make you Lord Mayor, by God. I'm thinking seriously of becoming a city father myself. What do you think?" Would I do for the job? Mr. O'Connor laughed. So far as owing money goes. Driving out of the mansion house, said Mr. Henchie, in all my vermin, with Jack here standing up behind me in a powdered wig, eh? And make me your private secretary, John. Yes. And I'll make Father Keegan my private chaplain. We'll have a family party. Faith, Mr. Henchie, said the old man, you keep up better style than some of them. I was talking one day to old Keegan, the porter. And how do you like your new master, Pat? Says I to him. You haven't much entertaining now, says I. Entertaining? Says he. He'd live on the smell of an oil rag. And do you know what he told me? Now, I declare to God I didn't believe him. What? Said Mr. Henchie and Mr. O'Connor. He told me, what do you think of a Lord Mayor of Dublin sending out for a pound of chops for his dinner? How's that for high living? Says he. Wisher, says I. A pound of chops, says he, coming into the mansion house. Wisher. Says I, what kind of people is going at all now? At this point there was a knock at the door, and a boy put in his head. What is it? Said the old man. From the _Black Eagle_, said the boy, walking in sideways and depositing a basket on the floor with a noise of shaken bottles. The old man helped the boy to transfer the bottles from the basket to the table and counted the full tally. Any bottles? What bottles? Said the old man. Won't you let us drink them first? Said Mr. Henchie. I was told to ask for the bottles. Come back tomorrow, said the old man. Here, boy, said Mr. Henchie, will you run over to O'Farrell's and ask him to lend us a corkscrew for Mr. Henchie, say. Tell him we won't keep it a minute. Leave the basket there. The boy went out and Mr. Henchie began to rub his hands cheerfully, saying, Ah, well, he's not so bad after all. He's as good as his word, anyhow. There's no tumblers, said the old man. Oh, don't let that trouble you, Jack, said Mr. Henchie. Menace the good man before now drank out of the bottle. Anyway, it's better than nothing, said Mr. O'Connor. He's not a bad sort, said Mr. Henchie, only Fanning has such a loan of him. He means well, you know, in his own tin-pot way. The boy came back with the corkscrew. Would you like a drink, boy? If you please, sir, said the boy. The old man opened another bottle grudgingly and handed it to the boy. What age are you? He asked. 17, said the boy. As the old man said nothing further, the boy took the bottle and said, Here's my best respects, sir. To Mr. Henchie, drank the contents, put the bottle back on the table and wiped his mouth with his sleeve. Then he took up the corkscrew and went out of the door sideways, muttering some form of salutation. That's the way it begins, said the old man. The thin edge of the wedge, said Mr. Henchie. The old man distributed the 3 bottles which he had opened and the men drank from them simultaneously. After having drunk each placed his bottle on the mantelpiece within hand's reach and drew in a long breath of satisfaction. Well, I did a good day's work today, said Mr. Henchie, after a pause. That so, John? Yes. I got him 1 or 2 sure things in Dawson Street, Crofton and myself. Between ourselves, you know, Crofton, he's a decent chap, of course, but he's not worth a damn as a canvasser. He hasn't a word to throw to a dog. He stands and looks at the people while I do the talking. Here 2 men entered the room. One of them was a very fat man whose blue serge clothes seemed to be in danger of falling from his sloping figure. He had a big face which resembled a young ox's face in expression, staring blue eyes and a grizzled moustache. The other man, who was much younger and frailer, had a thin, clean-shaven face. He wore a very high double collar and a wide-brimmed bowler hat. Hello, Crofton, said Mr. Henchie to the fat man. Talk of the devil. Where did the booze come from? Asked the young man. Did the cow calve? Oh, of course, Lion spots the drink first thing, said Mr. O'Connor, laughing. Is that the way you chaps canvass, said Mr. Lyons, and Crofton and I out in the cold and rain looking for votes? Why, blast your soul, said Mr. Henchie, I'd get more votes in 5 minutes than you two'd get in a week. Open 2 bottles of stout, Jack, said Mr. O'Connor. How can I? Said the old man, when there's no corkscrew. Wait now, said Mr. Henchie, getting up quickly. Did you ever see this little trick? He took 2 bottles from the table and, carrying them to the fire, put them on the hob. Then he sat down again by the fire and took another drink from his bottle. Mr. Lion sat on the edge of the table, pushed his hat towards the nape of his neck and began to swing his legs. Which is my bottle? He asked. This lad, said Mr. Henchie. Mr. Crofton sat down on a box and looked fixedly at the other bottle on the hob. He was silent for 2 reasons. The first reason, sufficient in itself, was that he had nothing to say. The second reason was that he considered his companions beneath him. He had been a canvasser for Wilkins, the Conservative, but when the Conservatives had withdrawn their man and, choosing the lesser of 2 evils, given their support to the Nationalist candidate, he had been engaged to work for Mr. Tierney. In a few minutes an apologetic "pock" was heard as the cork flew out of Mr. Lyon's bottle. Mr. Lyons jumped off the table, went to the fire, took his bottle and carried it back to the table. I was just telling them, Crofton, said Mr. Henchie, that we got a good few votes today. Who did you get? Asked Mr. Lyons. Well, I got Parks for 1, and I got Atkinson for 2, and got Ward of Dawson Street. Fine old chap he is, 2 regular old toff, old Conservative. But isn't your candidate a Nationalist? Said he. He's a respectable man, said I. He's in favour of whatever will benefit this country. He's a big ratepayer, I said. He has extensive house property in the city and 3 places of business, and isn't it to his own advantage to keep down the rates? He's a prominent and respected citizen, said I, and a poor law guardian, and he doesn't belong to any party, good, bad, or indifferent. That's the way to talk to Sem. And what about the address to the king? Said Mr. Lyons, after drinking and smacking his lips. Listen to me, said Mr. Henchie. What we want in this country, as I said to old Ward, is capital. The king's coming here will mean an influx of money into this country. The citizens of Dublin will benefit by it. Look at all the factories down by the quays there, idle. Look at all the money there is in the country if we only work the old industries, the mills, the shipbuilding yards and factories. It's capital we want. But look here, John, said Mr. O'Connor. Why should we welcome the King of England? Didn't Parnell himself? Parnell, said Mr. Henchie, is dead. Now, here's the way I look at it. Here's this chap come to the throne after his old mother keeping him out of it till the man was grey. He's a man of the world, and he means well by us. He's a jolly fine decent fellow, if you ask me, and no damn nonsense about him. He just says to himself, the old one never went to see these wild Irish. By Christ, I'll go myself and see what they're like. And are we going to insult the man when he comes over here on a friendly visit? Eh? Isn't that right, Crofton? Mr. Crofton nodded his head. But after all now, said Mr. Lyons argumentatively, King Edward's life, you know, is not the very. Let bygones be bygones, said Mr. Henchie. I admire the man personally. He's just an ordinary knockabout like you and me. He's fond of his glass of grog and he's a bit of a rake, perhaps, and he's a good sportsman. Damn it, can't we Irish play fair? That's all very fine, said Mr. Lyons. But look at the case of Parnell now. In the name of God, said Mr. Henchie, where's the analogy between the 2 cases? What I mean, said Mr. Lyons, is we have our ideals. Why, now, would we welcome a man like that? Do you think now after what he did Parnell was a fit man to lead us? And why, then, would we do it for Edward VII? This is Parnell's anniversary, said Mr. O'Connor, and don't let us stir up any bad blood. We all respect him now that he's dead and gone, even the Conservatives, he added, turning to Mr. Crofton. Pock! The tardy cork flew out of Mr. Crofton's bottle. Mr. Crofton got up from his box and went to the fire. Our side of the house respects him, because he was a gentleman. You are, Crofton. said Mr. Henchie fiercely. He was the only man that could keep that bag of cats in order. Down, ye dogs! Lie down, ye curs! That's the way he treated them. Come in, Joe! Come in! He called out, catching sight of Mr. Hines in the doorway. Mr. Hines came in slowly. Open another bottle of stout, Jack, said Mr. Henchie. Oh, I forgot there's no corkscrew. Here, show me one here and I'll put it at the fire. The old man handed him another bottle and he placed it on the hob. Sit down, Joe, said Mr. O'Connor. We're just talking about the chief. Said Mr. Henchie. Mr. Hines sat on the side of the table near Mr. Lyons but said nothing. There's one of them, anyhow, said Mr. Henchie, that didn't renege him. By God, I'll say for you, Joe. No, by God, you stuck to him like a man. Oh, Joe, said Mr. O'Connor suddenly. Give us that thing you wrote, do you remember? Have you got it on you? Oh, said Mr. Henchie. Give us that. Did you ever hear that, Crofton? Listen to this now, splendid thing. Go on, said Mr. O'Connor. Fire away, Joe. Mr. Hines did not seem to remember at once the piece to which they were alluding, but, after reflecting a while, he said, Oh, that thing is it? Sure, that's old now. Out with it, man, said Mr. O'Connor. Sure, said Mr. Henchie. Now, Joe. Mr. Hines hesitated a little longer. Then amid the silence he took off his hat, laid it on the table and stood up. He seemed to be rehearsing the piece in his mind. The Death of Parnell. 6_th October _1891 10_0. He cleared his throat once or twice and then began to recite. He is dead. Our uncrowned king is dead. Oh, Erin, mourn with grief and woe, for he lies dead whom the fell gang of modern hypocrites laid low. He lies slain by the coward hounds he raised to glory from the mire, and Erin's hopes and Erin's dreams perish upon her monarch's pyre. In palace, cabin or in cot the Irish heart where it be is bowed with woe, for he is gone who would have wrought her destiny. He would have had his Erin famed, the green flag gloriously unfurled, her statesmen, bards and warriors raised before the nations of the world. He dreamed, alas, 'twas but a dream, of liberty, but as he strove to clutch that idol, treachery sundered him from the thing he loved. Shame on the coward, caitiff hands that smote their lord or with a kiss betrayed him to the rabble-rout of fawning priests, no friends of his. May everlasting shame consume the memory of those who tried to befoul and smear the exalted name of one who spurned them in his pride. He fell as fall the mighty ones, nobly undaunted to the last, and death has now united him with Erin's heroes of the past. No sound of strife disturb his sleep. Calmly he rests, no human pain or high ambition spurs him now the peaks of glory to attain. They had their way, they laid him low. The day that brings us freedom's reign. And on that day may Erin well pledge in the cup she lifts to joy one grief the memory of Parnell. Mr. Hines sat down again on the table. When he had finished his recitation there was a silence and then a burst of clapping. Even Mr. Lyons clapped. The applause continued for a little time. When it had ceased all the auditors drank from their bottles in silence. Pop! The cork flew out of Mr. Hines' bottle, but Mr. Hines remained sitting flushed and bareheaded on the table. He did not seem to have heard the invitation. Good man, Joe, said Mr. O'Connor, taking out his cigarette papers and pouch the better to hide his emotion. What do you think of that, Crofton? Cried Mr. Henchie. Isn't that fine? What? Mr. Crofton said that it was a very fine piece of writing.